evening, friends. I'm Thomas Walker, and tonight I have a story for you that unfolds like something from a dark, forgotten corner of the past. It's the kind of tale that fills the air with tension, a story woven with crime, desperation, and the pursuit of something much more than money. The year is 1933. The Great Depression is still tightening its grip on the country, and crime, desperate crime, is on the rise. In the shadows, men and women are finding ways to survive, or perhaps to thrive, by means not so honest. It was in this climate that a man, already known in some circles for his trouble with the law, would make a move that would haunt him for the rest of his life. George Machine Gun Kelly, whose real name was George Barnes, was no stranger to a life of crime. Born in 1895, he'd made a name for himself during the Prohibition era, a time when men like him could find wealth in illegal activities, bootlegging, bank robberies, and whatever else the law couldn't catch. But Kelly wasn't just any gangster. He had a taste for violence, and he wasn't afraid to use a machine gun to get what he wanted. In fact, it was this weapon, his favorite tool of intimidation, that earned him his nickname, Machine Gun Kelly. But it was not until 1933 when he and his wife, Kathryn Kelly, became involved in the kidnapping of one of Oklahoma's wealthiest men, Charles Urschel, that Kelly truly entered the public eye. It was the night of July 22nd, 1933, when the crime began. Charles Urschel and his friend, Walter Jarrett, were playing cards on the screened porch of Urschel's estate in Oklahoma City. A peaceful night, one full of nothing more than laughter and the shuffle of cards, when the unexpected happened. Two men approached, one of them holding a machine gun, the other a pistol. They entered without warning, and in a chilling calm, demanded to know who Mr. Urschel was. When no immediate answer was given, they simply said, "Well, we will take both of them." Urschel and Jarrett were marched to the kidnapper's car, a Chevrolet sedan, and driven swiftly away from the safety of the estate. The women, Mrs. Urschel and Mrs. Jarrett, were left behind in terror, instructed not to call for help. But even so, Mrs. Urschel, terrified yet determined, made one call to J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. The wheels of an investigation began to turn, quietly at first, but swiftly picking up momentum. At 1 a.m. on July 23rd, 1933, Jarrett made his way back to the Urschel residence after being released by the kidnappers. They had taken him 12 miles out of Oklahoma City, a secluded stretch of dirt road, before discarding him with $50 they found in his wallet. He had been warned not to follow them, not to speak of the direction they had gone. But despite the warnings, Jarrett did exactly what the kidnappers had hoped he wouldn't. He went to the authorities, and soon the investigation into the crime began in earnest. The FBI, under the watchful eyes of Hoover himself, would soon learn that this was no ordinary kidnapping. The criminals, led by the notorious George Kelly, were not just after money. They were playing a game of fear, and the ransom, a staggering $200,000, was just the beginning. As the investigation unfolded, an unsettling pattern emerged. The first letter, written by Urschel himself and delivered to a friend, contained an ominous demand. The kidnappers required $200,000 in used $20 bills, and the instructions for delivering it were bizarre. The ransom had to be delivered by train, and the bag of money was to be thrown out at a specific point along the track after passing a fire on the right side. If there was any attempt at trickery, the consequences were clear. Urschel's life would end. The plan was laid out, but something wasn't right. The FBI agents on the case worked quickly, tracking every move, analyzing every letter, and studying the detailed instructions in the ransom notes. The involvement of George Kelly and his wife Kathryn, who, it seemed, was every bit as involved in the crime as her husband, began to surface. But even with the clues piling up, one question remained unanswered. Would Urschel make it out alive? The ransom had been demanded, $200,000, all in used $20 bills. The instructions were clear: no tricks, no double crosses. The kidnappers were precise in their demands, and they weren't about to tolerate any deviation from their plan. As expected, the FBI did not waste time, ensuring that every detail was meticulously followed, every instruction carefully executed. And so, on July 29th, 1933, a plan was set into motion. A trusted intermediary, J.J.G. Catlett, who was a close friend of Mr. Urschel, was chosen to deliver the ransom money. The FBI had prepared for every eventuality, even though they knew the risks. They placed the money in two identical bags, one filled with cash, and the other, just in case, stuffed with old magazines. The money, packed carefully in leather Gladstone bags, was to be delivered to Kansas City, Missouri. But things didn't go exactly as planned. The instructions called for the money to be thrown from the train at a precise moment, near a fire on the right side of the track. Everything had to be perfect. But as Catlett and Kirkpatrick, the man accompanying him, boarded the train and made their way toward the exchange point, something strange began to unfold. As the hours passed, there was no sign of the fire, no signal, no clear indication that the kidnappers were even watching. What was supposed to be a well-coordinated drop seemed to fall apart. Was it all part of the plan, or was something else happening? Something that no one had anticipated for hours. The two men waited on the observation platform, hoping for a signal, a single, unmistakable cue that would allow them to proceed with the handoff. But nothing. No fire, no instructions. The minutes stretched into hours, and by the time the train reached Kansas City, the ransom money had never been exchanged. Catlett and Kirkpatrick were left waiting in their hotel room for further instructions, but nothing came. A telegram arrived, advising them of a delay. The kidnappers seemed to have disappeared into the shadows, but the investigation continued, and the FBI was not about to let this stall the momentum. They combed through every lead, checked every possible connection, and yet, despite all the resources poured into the search, the kidnappers remained one step ahead. The authorities had their suspicions, of course. They believed George Kelly and his wife Kathryn were at the center of the plot, but they had no direct evidence to connect them to the ransom money. The Kellys were elusive, hiding in plain sight, moving from town to town, avoiding capture. It was during this search that the next twist came. Authorities began to receive strange, seemingly unrelated pieces of information, a series of untraceable phone calls, anonymous letters, and cryptic messages. There were whispers of people who knew the Kellys, individuals who had helped them move around the country, who had sheltered them when the heat began to rise. But where were they hiding now? And more importantly, why were they dragging their feet when it came to the ransom exchange? As the days passed, the mystery only deepened. What had happened to the ransom money? Had the kidnappers changed their minds about the exchange? Or was something else at play here? The FBI's pressure grew, but so did the uncertainty. They knew George "Machine Gun" Kelly was behind it all, but the question remained, would they catch him before it was too late? Then, a break. The FBI's investigation turned toward Memphis, Tennessee. A tip led them to a home where the Kellys had been staying. Agents rushed to Memphis, and by the early hours of September 26, 1933, they executed a raid. The Kellys were finally captured, but the question still hung in the air. How had they managed to stay so elusive for so long? And what had happened to the ransom money? George Kelly, allegedly caught without a weapon, was said to have surrendered with the infamous words, "Don't shoot, G-men, don't shoot." But whether he uttered those words is uncertain, likely a myth created by the media in the aftermath of the arrest. What is certain, however, is that his capture marked the end of a long chase. He and his wife, Kathryn, were now in custody. Their capture marked the beginning of the end for the infamous criminal, whose name had been linked to a string of daring crimes. The FBI had closed in, finally cornering Kelly and his associates. But the questions surrounding the kidnapping of Urschel had not yet been fully answered. The Kellys were arrested in late September 1933, but by then, the story had already taken a darker turn. The ransom money, $200,000, remained unaccounted for. Was it lost in the chaos of the FBI's pursuit? Was it hidden away, waiting to be discovered in some forgotten place? Or had Kelly and his associates used it to fund their escape, their last grasp at freedom before the law caught up to them? As George Kelly stood trial, the prosecution built its case on the evidence they had gathered. The kidnapping itself was a simple enough crime to prove. The planning, the ransom demand, the capture of Urschel. But the true mystery lay in the question of the ransom money. Kelly's capture was a victory for the FBI, but there was something still unsettling about the case. The details of how the kidnappers had used their time in hiding, the trail they left behind, were muddled. Were there others involved in the scheme? Was there a network of criminals aiding Kelly? Or had he worked alone, with just his wife Kathryn by his side, his machine gun the only tool he needed? The trial that followed was swift. Kelly was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, alongside his wife Kathryn, who was sentenced to 25 years for her role in the crime. But even with their convictions, the full story was never truly laid bare. The ransom money, though never recovered, was presumed to have been spent, hidden, or lost in the shuffle of the FBI's investigation. But no one could say for sure where it went. The uncertainty lingered, as though something had slipped through the cracks of the investigation. A missing piece, a detail that no one could quite grasp. Over the years, George Kelly's reputation as a dangerous criminal faded, though his name still stirs memories of a time when crime and notoriety seemed inseparable. After serving many years of his sentence, Kelly's life came to an end in 1954, not in the violent escape he might have imagined, but in the quiet isolation of a prison cell. His legacy, though marked by violence, remained tainted by the mystery of what happened to the ransom money. What became of that fortune, $200,000 in 1933, remains one of the great unsolved questions of this case. The FBI believed they had uncovered the full extent of the kidnapping, and yet the money was never found. Was it hidden away, passed through criminal hands, or used to fuel another scheme? Or was it simply lost, never to be recovered? As the years passed, The details of the case became obscured by time. The names of those involved faded into history, and the kidnapping of Charles F. Urschel became one of many forgotten crimes in the annals of the 1930s. Yet, in the quiet spaces of history, the questions linger. We may never know what really happened to the ransom money. We may never know the full extent of George "Machine Gun" Kelly's criminal network, or the true motives behind his desperate crime. But there is one thing that remains clear: the shadow of that crime. The planning, the fear, the violence still hangs over us, a reminder of a time when even the most careful criminals could be undone by a single misstep. And so, my friends, we are left with this thought. Sometimes the truth is not in the things we find, but in the things we cannot. The missing ransom money, the motivations behind Kelly's actions, the final, haunting question that remains unanswered. What was the true price of this crime? And where, in the end, did the money go? The story of George "Machine Gun" Kelly may have ended, but the questions, my friends, are far from over. And some mysteries, no matter how carefully we investigate, them remain locked in the shadows forever.